anyone over here, I'm going to be blocking their view. I kind of feel bad when I block the view of some folks. Is this on this morning? All right. All right, so the title of our lesson for this Bible class period on this beautiful day, as has already been mentioned. Sometimes don't you wish if it was a little warmer, we could just, have this outside. That'd almost be nice to talk about God's creation, not evolution, right? On a day like today. It's a blessing. Alleged proofs of evolution exposed. By the way, before I get into this, let me mention that in the after Bible class, you may want to check some of these materials out. There are some free materials in the back, including some of the things I talked about last night. Alleged atheist-making Bible verses you need to know. So a lot of that is in written form in the back. This is part 1. Part 2 I thought I had, but I don't have with me. You can find that online on our website for free if you would like in electronic form. Also in the back, there are some free discovery issues. This particular one it's about the flood, and it's kind of a preview of the VBS material that we have coming out this year. And also there's one in the back called Believing in John 3:16, and the whole discussion here is, what does it mean to believe in John 3:16? So this could be a very practical issue that you and your family may benefit from, or that you have some friends or neighbors, co-workers, maybe some fellow students in school that you would like to just have this. We're eventually going to be turning this one into a tract so that we can give those out to our friends. And then a lot of this material that I'm covering this morning is in the book Truth Be Told in the back. Some of you probably have this book, and you can find some of it. I believe it's in chapter 8, one of the latter chapters of this book, Alleged Proofs of Evolution Exposed. For many years now, a lot of your leading evolutionists have alleged not that evolution is a hypothesis, not that it is more than a hypothesis like just a theory, even though it's called the general theory of evolution, but it's been alleged for many years now by, again, leading evolutionists around the world that evolution is a fact. W. Howells wrote as far back as 1944, like digestion. Richard Goldschmidt wrote in the 1950s. He said evolution of the animal plant world is considered by all those entitled to a judgment to be a fact for which no further proof is needed. How do you like that? Does that ring of elitism? All of those entitled to a judgment, they know that evolution is a fact. So if you don't believe based upon what you observe every day, and based upon what we see around us, that's what science is, really. Is it not just the study of the natural realm? How do you study it? Well, you see it, you hear it, you taste it, you touch it, you smell it. Use your senses that God has given us. Oh, well, the atheist, I know, doesn't believe in God, but you study things. So does a study of the natural realm lead us to believe that evolution is a fact? If not, apparently we are not entitled to a judgment. I'm going to go through several of these quotes and then we'll move on. Julian Huxley wrote as far back as 1960, the first point to make about Darwin's theory, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, is that it is no longer a theory, but a fact. No serious scientist would deny the fact that evolution has occurred. No serious scientist. So if you do doubt the fact, apparently you are not a serious scientist. George Kirkut wrote in 1960 as well, there's a theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. This theory can be called the general theory of evolution. So when you want to know what we mean and what they mean by evolution, well, the generally accepted idea or definition of it would be right here what George Kirkut has said several decades ago, that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from a non-living form. That's the theory, that's the general theory of biological evolution. And if you don't like that definition, well, George Simpson said, Dr. George Gaylord Simpson, one of the more well-known evolutionists of last century, he said evolution is a fully natural process inherent in the physical properties of the universe by which life arose in the first place, and by which all living things, past or present, have since developed divergently and progressively. The idea of pure naturalism, pure and only physical matter, no supernatural, no spirit realm creating the physical realm, but just matter. And that's how it all came about. That's how it arose. Somehow we got matter from non-matter, matter from nothing. Somehow we got life from non-life. And then life allegedly evolved, developed divergently in all different directions and progressively from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms to here we are today. And how factual is this? Well, it's been stated in textbooks for many decades now that things like, well, reputable biologists, all reputable biologists have agreed that evolution of life on Earth is an established fact. Supposedly, no serious biologist today doubts the fact of evolution. The fact of evolution is amply clear. So if you do doubt the fact of evolution, the alleged fact of evolution, if you do doubt it, and you are a scientist, then maybe they would just say, well, you must not be a serious scientist. And then the renowned Stephen Jay Gould of last century and the early part of this century said evolution is a fact like apples falling out of trees. Evolution is as well documented as any phenomenon in science, as strongly as the Earth's revolution around the sun, rather than vice versa. In this sense, we can call evolution a fact. And then Michael LePage wrote in New Scientist magazine just a few years ago, in 2008, he said evolution is as firmly established a scientific fact as the roundness of the Earth. One last one here. By now, Thomas Hayden wrote in 2002 in a cover story titled The New Reality of Evolution. By now, scientists say evolution is no longer just a theory. It's an everyday phenomenon, a fundamental fact of biology, as real as hunger and as unavoidable as death. You may remember a few years ago, there was a sticker that the Cobb County School Board adopted to put in the front of their science textbooks that said, this textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. But then the beloved, or not so beloved, ACLU got involved with just a handful of parents there in the Marietta, Georgia area. And they filed a lawsuit saying that this was unconstitutional. Can you believe that? Don't you dare put that in textbooks. Don't put that in evolutionary textbooks and science textbooks like this one that came from Graves County, Kentucky a few years ago. Well, that would just be unconstitutional. Why? I mean, does the sticker say anything about God? Not that there should be a problem with that either. You know, textbooks, taxpayer-paid textbooks in this country used to have God all in them and talked about God and the existence of God and the creation of God. I mean, whether you were studying spelling or whether you were studying history or whether you were studying English, there were a lot of textbooks that were used that talked about how God created everything in 6 days, that talked about how we ought to act, that talked about morality, that talked about all sorts of things that now supposedly there's this great separation between church and state, so that the state can never even mention creation or any kind of foundational, fundamental thoughts like we discussed Friday night. We discussed why we're here, and why we're here is grounded. The answer to that question is rooted and grounded in where we came from. And where we came from was, well, nature itself testifies that it came from, that nature itself, that matter came from a creator. Matter demands a creator, one who originated it. It didn't come from nothing, but that's what atheism ultimately says. In 2004, a federal judge refused to dismiss the lawsuit, saying it could have the effect of advancing religion in this country, and we wouldn't want that to happen, would we? Can you believe that? He went on to say, while the disclaimer has no biblical reference, it encourages students to consider alternatives other than evolution. We wouldn't want that to happen, would we? You just believe whatever we tell you to believe, and don't you dare question anything. We shouldn't be that way even with the truth. God exists and the Bible is His Word. But if we have questions in the church, if we have questions in Bible class, now Eric, how do you know this? Or how can we discover this? Or how can we truly be convinced? Where's the evidence for? Nothing wrong with asking those questions. Especially if they're asked from good and honest hearts, not like the Pharisees always trying to entangle Jesus in this talk and trying to entrap Him, and He knew their motivations. If our motivations are pure and we're asking questions, isn't that a great way to learn? Study things carefully, critically consider them, and with an open mind. But hey, don't you dare sit in a classroom with the school teacher and textbooks that are supported by, paid for by taxpayer money, And I appreciate Christian school teachers who go into the public school system and are trying to let their light shine and teach others. But apparently, don't you dare go in there and teach creation or teach. This isn't even about creation necessarily. Now, apparently they're afraid of the implication. Well, wait a minute, evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. Well, wait a minute, that could encourage students to consider something other than evolution. Well, maybe the facts maybe we should just be led by the facts and let the facts and the truth lead us to wherever it should lead us, instead of just blindly. You want to talk about blind faith? This is blind faith. This is you just believe whatever we tell you to believe and don't you ask any questions. This is sad. U.S. District Judge Clarence Cooper said the sticker also has the effect of implicitly bolstering alternative religious theories of origin by suggesting that evolution is a problematic theory even in the field of science. By denigrating evolution, it simply says, I showed all those earlier quotations to say, hey, listen, so if you doubt the fact of evolution, whoa, you put a sticker in the front of textbooks that say, hey, evolution is a theory, not a fact. Wait just a minute here. You're denigrating evolution now. That's where we've gotten in this country. By denigrating evolution, the school board appears to be endorsing the well-known prevailing alternative theory, creationism, or variations thereof, even though the sticker does not specifically reference any alternative theories. Can you detect just a little concern here? Wait a minute now. We can't, did the sticker say anything about creation? Did it say anything about Genesis 1? Did it say anything about Jesus? Did it say anything about Christianity or the Bible? No. It said, hey, study this carefully, critically, and with an open mind. Evolution is not a fact regarding the origin of these things. It's a theory. It's not even a good theory. And so, here's the sticker that was eventually taken out of the textbooks. By the way, the sticker actually has to do with evolution and the origin of life. It's not necessarily even talking about, well, after life gets here, it's the origin of life. And what we know about the origin of life is that all life in nature comes from previous life of its own kind. In nature, life comes from life, and that of its own kind. That's what the law of biogenesis says. So wait a minute. You're telling me we'll teach kids about Louis Pasteur's experiments in the 1800s, mid-1800s, that proved once and for all that spontaneous generation does not happen, that spontaneous generation of life does not happen, abiogenesis, that life does not come from non-life. Even Pasteur proved on a microscopic level. We have that in textbooks. You probably remember some of those statements and images, pictures. You remember he's the one who had the different broth and the different flasks. This was years after Francisco Redi had already proved that life didn't come from life. That life did not come from non-life, always came from life, but Louis Pasteur proved it on a microscopic level. Wait a minute, it's once and for all, this is done. We've known it now for nearly 200 years, that even on a microscopic level that doesn't happen. And yet we can't put a sticker in the front of textbooks that says evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of life. And so they were told that even if you're studying this with an open mind, carefully and critically, apparently that's just not good enough. In this book, Evolution, Change Over Time, if you want to know some of the best alleged evidence for evolution, I suppose that books like this, would be the ones, the sources to go to. It's not real difficult to understand. This is on about a middle school level, and it's only about 100 pages. So let's look and see what they say. I mean, what you think if you were to ask me to write a book on the inspiration of the Bible or the existence of God, and you say, Eric, you got 100 pages. You think I'm going to put my best evidence in there or my weakest? You give me 100 pages. Now, for a preacher, that's not a whole lot of room, right? Us long-winded preachers. It's kind of like you say, Eric, you got 20 minutes to talk. I can barely get through my introduction in 20 minutes. Come on now. Even with a sore throat. So, I mean, you're going to put your best or your worst? Well, you would think they put their very best in here. I mean, just a 100-page book, not very big. So what do they say? Well, I mean, here's an example, allegedly, of evolution that should help us understand that evolution occurs. Back in the Industrial Revolution, well, let me just read it straight from the textbook here, just so you can see I'm not making this stuff up. In the 1850s, most of the peppered moss near Manchester, England, were gray in color. Only a few black moths existed because the gray moths were almost the same color as the tree trunks on which they lived. As more factories were built during the Industrial Revolution here, soot from chimneys blackened the tree trunks. The gray moths could now be seen against the tree trunks. The few surviving black moths, however, now blended in with the tree trunk so that we have a shift in the English peppered moth population. And this takes up about, well, one whole page, basically, in a book on evolution as alleged proof of evolution. This has been in textbooks now, well, almost for, 40 years? A little over 40 years now. And plus, I mean, this is just one of the earlier pages that we have a record of. Likely long before this, because Dr. Kettlewell first proposed this back in the mid-1950s as evidence for evolution by natural selection. Since then, it's appeared in many biology texts as evidence of evolution, but there's a few problems. Well, at least mainly two. Number one, it really didn't happen, at least the way he says it happened. You see, these moths do not live or rest normally on tree trunks. Very few of these moths have ever been seen resting on tree trunks in the last few decades. Kettlewell actually glued 2 dead moths on a tree trunk to take the now famous photographs. Since then, it has appeared in many biology texts as alleged evidence of evolution, but his results never have been replicated. And yet, you remember the textbook says, the tree trunks on which they live. Not only do they not live on the tree trunks, you rarely see them on there. So the way the story is even told in the textbooks, it's not accurate, at least not completely accurate. Well, you might say, well, Eric, why is this even in the textbooks? If the way they tell the story, it's not accurate. Canadian textbook writer Bob Ritter was interviewed a few years ago. You can read about this in Jonathan Wells' book, Icons of Evolution. Asking, why is this in the textbook? He said, well, you have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for the first-time learner? You got to look at the audience. Kids, young people, I'd be offended by this statement. It's like, hey, look who we're dealing with here. These young people, they can't really handle the truth. They can't really handle complicated stuff. So we're going to make it really simple, and we're going to tell them things that are not quite right. But we got to simplify it for them. But it's not quite right. We could simplify biblical matters, but if it's not true, what's the point of simplifying it? We'd be a false teacher for doing that. The advantage, he said, of this example of natural selection is that it is extremely visual. Well, who stinking cares if it's extremely visual if it's not true? I mean, we could paste lizards on church walls and say, lizards, geckos, they're evolving, from the church building walls. It's a visual thing. It's kind of dumb, right? But it's visual. Well, who cares? It's not true. We want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, high school students, can look at the work critically. Part of the problem is high school students, when students become high school students or when they become college students, oftentimes they're fed the exact same stuff. We had a teacher contact us several years ago, and she said, I was taught this in school, in high school, in college. I was trained to be a teacher, and I've been teaching this stuff, and I didn't realize till I came across some Apologetics Press material that the way that I've been teaching this is not even true. But then let me add this. Even if it was true, what would it prove? I mean, if you have a shift in the English peppered moth population, which apparently there was a shift, not the way they talk about it precisely in the textbooks, but what does that prove? Did the English peppered moths, did they change into chickens? Did they evolve, fins and start, flopping around in the water? They didn't change in anything. They were always English peppered moths. when we breed dogs, if you continue to breed dogs with big dogs, then you genetically breed out, right? Are you going to have 2 Great Danes and get a Chihuahua from 2 Great Danes? Pure blood Great Danes? I doubt that's going to happen. I mean, unless there was just a smidgen of genetic material for the Chihuahua, I don't think that's going to happen. But does that mean, that evolution does or does not occur, the kind of evolution they're talking about? Here's the thing. When we see this material so often in the textbooks, what we find is, number one, it's inaccurate the way they say it. Number two, even if it was true, what would it actually prove? Listen, all creationists and Christians that I know of, we understand that natural selection happens. That is, if there is a lion chasing 2 gazelles, and one of the gazelles has 3 legs and one has 4 legs, which one is the lion likely going to eat and catch and eat? The one with 3 legs. Nature selects, if you will. All right? So we don't necessarily disagree that we understand that happens. When my dog, that's a half Springer Spaniel, half Weenie dog, but half Springer Spaniel, he's got some of that bird dog in him, and he loves to look at and chase and try to capture birds. And he's done that 2 or 3 times that I know of in his life. You know which birds he probably normally gets to? Likely the weaker ones, the ones that are not as strong, not as aware. And so you have Shadow, my little dog, he's selecting which ones, naturally, which ones he can get to the easiest, the best. And so you have weaker ones that oftentimes die out. There's no proof that we came from ape-like creatures because we see that played out every day. That is natural selection, selective adaptation. Well, let's move on to another alleged proof of evolution, and let's try to expose this for what it is. This is Ernst Haeckel. Actually, this is Charles Darwin. Ernst Haeckel says the turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1860. And Ernst Haeckel, he's most famous for a set of photographs that allegedly showed the evolution of the human being in utero. The baby in the mother's womb allegedly goes through the evolutionary stages of our alleged ancestors. And so allegedly we have gill slits like fish when we're early on in our embryonic development, and then supposedly we have tails like monkeys, anthropoid-like tails, like our alleged ape-like ancestors and alleged relatives, and then we became human. That's his story. He's quite famous for this, and by the way, a form of this story has been told in textbooks for years. As you can see, the embryos of a fish, chicken, rabbit, and human appear almost identical in their early stages. What does this mean? Similarities in similarities in the embryos of different organisms indicate that these organisms share a common ancestor. That's what they say. That is, these organisms all share a common heritage. The similarities in the early stages of embryo development are alleged further evidence that living things have evolved from earlier living things, and that many living things share a common ancestor. Still, this basic idea taught to kids in school all over the world, that evolution must be true because in the early stages of our lives, in utero, we go through a fish stage and we go through a monkey stage. That proves that we came from fish and monkeys? Is that right? Well, actually, the drawings that Ernst Haeckel drew, not quite that accurate, because now that we can actually take pictures, isn't that amazing? We can take pictures of the embryos of different animals and a human at the stages that he supposedly drew them. There are a good bit of differences. Now get this. Almost 100 years ago, Sir Arthur Keith wrote, it was expected that the embryo would recapitulate. That's a big fancy word that basically means retrace. would retrace the features of its ancestors from the lowest to the highest forms in the animal kingdom. Now that the appearance of the embryo at all stages is known, the general feeling is one of disappointment. The human embryo at no stage is anthropoid in appearance. You mean we've known this for decades, and it still gets basically put in textbooks, this idea of proof of evolution because of similarities in embryological development between some animals and humans. And here we go, just selling another alleged proof of evolution. I would contend just selling a lie. And so Ernst Haeckel, Stephen Jay Gould said, remains most famous today as the chief architect and propagandist for the famous argument that science disproved long ago, but the popular culture has never fully abandoned. Stephen Jay Gould said, we should therefore not be surprised, and he's a famous atheistic evolutionist of the latter part of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century. Be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. Before I move on, let me just also add a couple of things here. Number one, can't you see how abortionists would love if this was true? Oh, we're just allowing mothers and their doctors, so-called doctors, to just kill a living animal inside of them. I'm sorry, that's not a living animal. It's a human being. But again, let me just say, well, you know, the alleged similarities on an embryological level have been highly exaggerated at best and just completely wrong at worst and inaccurate. However, what if there were some similarities in appearance between a monkey and a human embryo? What if there were some similarities? Let's think critically, what would that actually prove? Could it not simply be that it just is evidence of a common creator, and he created humans and some animals, and sometimes there are similarities that doesn't prove that we evolved from a common single-celled organism hundreds of millions of years ago? You see, my point is, they take some ideas and some things that might be a little right and then a lot wrong, and they say, well, look here, look at these similarities. They prove that we came from... What does it actually prove? And I want to mention that as we show you this on the previous page. What they say is, well, look at these similarities. Similarities between the arm of the human being, the wing of a bat, the flipper of the whale, and the leg of a dog. And they say, well, here's similarities that prove we came from a common ancestor, not a common creator. A common ancestor from which we all allegedly evolved. Look closely at the structure of the bones in the bat's wing, the dog's foreleg, the whale's fin, the human's arm. These similarities indicate that each organism has evolved from a common ancestor. Is that what they prove? See, so often with ideas like evolution and the contrasting paradigm and the biblical explanation of creation, oftentimes it's not that we're looking at two different things. Now sometimes, like in the false drawings that Ernst Haeckel did, that would be the case. We're not looking at what reality is. But let's think about the flipper of the whale and the leg of a dog. Think about that dog for a minute. There's similarities between dogs and humans. Did y'all know that? You come to my house, you know what you're going to find? You're going to find a mutt, an accident, you're going to find a little dog that breathes the same air that I breathe. He's got a nose, and he's got a mouth. And you know what? I've got a nose and a mouth. We're similar. Does that mean we evolved from some animal, some organism hundreds of millions of years ago? We breathe the same air. We drink the same water. We eat. Sometimes he gets a little bit of taste of chicken. Normally he has dog food that I don't eat. Sometimes he eats my food. We can eat some of the same food. Does that mean that we evolved? We walk on the same backyard, on the same grass, in the same house. Yes, he's a house dog. He's part of the family, been there for 10 years. There's similarities. What does that actually prove, though? My contention is it doesn't prove evolution whatsoever. That's just what they hope, they wish, they would like for it to prove. But there's no proof. It just... I'm a creationist. This is what I see. The evolutionist, he says, wait a minute, there's similarities there. Yeah, there are. Those similarities prove that we evolved from an amphibian, that evolved from a worm, that evolved from a single-celled organism. That's what the evolutionary tree of life illustrates, right? Where did you get that from? Well, because we have some similarities with the leg of a dog. Yeah, there's similarities there. What does that actually prove? There's similarities. You see, we can talk about the existence of God, and I was so proud. One of your members, Sister, what's her name? Tracy. I'm sorry, Tracy, I forgot your name. I was so proud that Tracy, I mentioned Friday night, that last year when I was here, or a year or two, I think it was last year, that I did a lesson on 7 reasons to believe in God. And Tracy came up to me afterwards. I'm sorry, I'm embarrassing you, Tracy. I'm sorry. She came up to me afterwards. She said, you're right. You did preach that, because I still have it in my notebook. And I thought, man, that's really cool. Really cool. Well, you know, Tracy won't find in those notes proof of evolution, similarities with animals. Won't find that in that lesson. But you know what? When I look at similarities between animals and humans, you know what I see? Is a gracious God. What do you mean by that, Eric? I'm thankful that there are some similarities. I mean, I'm thankful that when we run out of dog food, I can just give my dog some chicken. He can eat it and have his tummy full. He prefers chicken anyway. All right? I'm thankful that I can just feed him the same tap water that I drink. And I don't have to, go to the store or something and buy some kind of specialized whatever that can't work for human beings, but, is the only thing that can work for him. I'm thankful that there are some similarities. I'm thankful that when I tore my anterior cruciate ligament, when I was a junior in high school, my left knee, I tore my right one my senior year. That was a bum time of life. I tell you what. I just wanted to play ball, and they said, nope, you got 2 bad knees. Okay, so I was thankful that I got to go and have a doctor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Dr. Mowerman, who had done probably hundreds or thousands of these kinds of surgeries. He was going to help me out. He said, Eric, we can replace your anterior cruciate ligament, your ACL, with a part of your patella tendon. We can slice a third of your patella tendon and then screw it there where your ACL was. Or we can take it from a cadaver, or we can take it from a goat. I said, nah, we're not going to have that. We're not going to have that. I didn't say it quite like that, but the only reason that the animal idea was an option, why? Because there are some similarities. You know why I'm thankful for there being some similarities? And I contend, I don't give this as proof of creation and proof of the existence of God, but if God does exist, you know what makes sense in a loving, generous way? That our God would have some similarities. There would be some similarities that he would have instilled into his created living things, so that the ones who are created in the image of God, who have been told to have dominion and subdue the earth and have dominion over it, even all of the sheep and the cattle and the things that are in the oceans, Psalm chapter 8, that there are some similarities that are there for our benefit. My dad takes blood pressure medicine, I guess, every day. He just turned 85 just a couple of days ago. I'm thankful my dad, was not the one who was experimented on with high blood pressure medicine. You know, before any human being has ever given medicine to help, hopefully in some way, you know what has always happened before that? I mean, at least in modern times. They test these things on animals. What good would it do to test different types of things that might hopefully one day help human beings? What good would it do to test them on animals if animals have no similarities whatsoever to human beings? What good would it do? I thought maybe the batteries had gone out again. I saw Railing, I was like, well, I guess the batteries went out again. Not today, not today. You see what we're getting at here is because there are similarities, even in mice, that certain things can be tested on them, maybe tested on other animals before ever tested on human beings. And so this is not proof of evolution. This is simply looking at the same thing that evolutionists are looking at and saying, that doesn't prove anything. And yet this is what you're teaching. Hundreds of millions of young people all over the world, billions. Oh yeah, we came from baboons, ape-like creatures, whatever, because there are similarities. That doesn't prove anything. By the way, let me also add that evolution in and of itself, it's not a bad word. You know, the word evolution, the idea is evolve, the idea is change. Do we change? Sure, we change. Look, every year I come here, or every few years I come here, you see me with more gray hair than I had the year before. My hair is changing color. You've probably seen my waist grow in from past years. I change, you change. Dogs can change, human beings can change. But here is a key difference. Evolution occurs on a micro level. That is, there is change, but change always, according to the Bible and according to real, observable, operational science, change always has limits. You know, when we look around here and we have I don't know, however many, over 100 we have here this morning. Are there differences in us? But are we all human beings? But aren't there a lot of differences? Maybe it's the color of our skin. Maybe it's the color of our eyes. Maybe it's the texture of our hair. Maybe it's whether we have hair or not. Maybe it's what color it is. All sorts of differences. Did we all come from Adam and Eve? Yeah. You see, there are genetic differences that were all there in the beginning when God created Adam and Eve, and with Noah, his wife, their 3 sons and their wives, when they got off of the ark hundreds of years later and repopulated the earth. So change happens, but change has limits. We can get Brangus cows from Angus and Brahman cows. We can get spring weenies from a Springer Spaniel and a weenie dog. That's not a real breed, I don't think. It's just kind of made up, right? But you know, I've heard of golden doodles. I've heard of peekapoos and cockapoos. And I've heard of varieties of roses. But you're not going to get a half rose, half chicken. You know, you're not going to get a hippo that gives birth to a giraffe, or a giraffe that gives birth to an alligator. Change has limits, and that's a huge difference between creation and evolution. And you know what the Bible has always said? In fact, it's right there. In the very first chapter of the Bible, evolution is refuted as far as what the Bible teaches versus what evolution says and what we know to be the truth. Because what we know is that life comes from life and that of its own kind. Okay? The Bible says right here in Genesis chapter 1 that God created life. On day 3, he made land to appear, and on that land he made plant life. And on days 5 and 6, he made animal life, and he made human life. And then once he made all those varieties of life, he said that the seed was in itself, according to its kind, like the vegetation that was made on day 3. Oh, so the seed reproduces how? After its kind. Are there varieties within kinds? Sure, there are. There's a lot of variety in humanity, in humankind. right? I mean, you go around the world, some peoples, you'll find a lot of maybe shorter people in some countries. In other countries, I think I read the other day that in one of the Scandinavian countries, the average man is 6 feet tall. The average man. I forgot which one it was, but so sometimes when you think about, well, the average height of humans in this country and the average height of humans in that country, there can be almost a foot difference depending on which countries you're talking about. But are they still human beings? Yeah. Is there some variety there in skin color and hair color and eye color, in size and some shapes of noses and ears? And yeah. But change has limits. And the general theory of evolution says, no, we can evolve from ape-like creatures over millions of years. That's not what science says. That's not what real science says. And that's not what the Bible says. And thus I'm not going to teach, and I'm not going to tolerate my kids or churches where we have some influence. Because there are a lot of Christians today who are buying into evolutionary theory, and they're just saying, well, evolution and the Bible somehow have to all fit together. Do I hear, is there going to be a bell that rings that I hear, or am I just supposed to stop at it? That was the last bell. I just knew that because Rellin got up. Is that right, Rellin? All right. Well, thank you for your good attention. I look forward to the worship hour together. And if you're interested in these materials, just remember, I don't make anything off of this. So if y'all want that, you're just helping a nonprofit organization like AP. And I really hope that you enjoy the study Bibles that many of you have. We're excited about that. I hope that you'll get those, you'll use them. Maybe you'll think about getting some for family members or friends or others who you think could use that because maybe they're weaker in the faith or maybe they're not Christians and could use something like that. Thank you very much.